Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So welcome, engagers, once again to Professor Game Podcast, because today we have, once again, an interesting person who is coming to talk about his experience in games and all these things in the field. But before we introduce Scott, are you prepared to engage?
Yes, I'm prepared.
Let's do this. Scott is a successful instructor and business owner with more than 24 years of experience in networking, video conferencing technology, and project management. He currently serves as an assistant teaching professor at the University of Missouri, where his interests are focused on the impact of technology on society and human well-being. And I'm going to add here as well that he has created the blockchain game that helps people understand what the blockchain is about, especially for people who are non-technical. And he's also, well, of course, this game has been used by many instructors and companies around the world. And he's also working on future projects within this field. So very exciting stuff going on, Scott. Is there anything that we missed from that intro?
No, I would say that academia is kind of a second career for me. So I find it very engaging to be learning from students, to be able to tell them a little bit about what it's going to be like to deal with an ever-changing world as far as technology. So I get a big thrill, and I feel like I'm younger from interacting with students now.
So you found the fountain of youth.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, J. Scott Christianson, what does a regular day with you look like? If we were Scott in a day like today, yesterday, tomorrow, in a week's time, what would it feel like? What are the kinds of things that get you excited? What are you doing in these days?
Well, obviously teaching. So I'm a teaching professor. I teach 4 different courses this fall. So I'm usually up pretty early, try to block out time for some deep thinking, some work on different projects, and then I'm often involved in teaching and working on kind of random things later in the afternoon. But a lot of what we do talk about in classes is technology, and really a lot about what's going on right now as far as the impact on society, some of the controversies going on with these kind of tech backlash that we're seeing right now and why that's happening. So it's kind of an exciting time to be talking about technology, especially with young people, and as they're coming into their own and thinking about how is this affecting our world today, how is this affecting our politics.
Very interesting. And there's been an ongoing conversation, at least in this podcast, about the ethics involved in serious games, gamification, and all of this. So I'm guessing that there's also been a lot of ethical discussions around technology in general for you. So there we might have a pathway as well to a rabbit hole to go down over here. It
was kind of funny. The one of our evaluations, we go through this kind of review of your curriculum at a college level, and they said, well, are you really teaching anything about ethics? And when you teach these technology classes, I was like, well, we have a very hard time not, getting down these rabbit holes about ethics, personal data, how we're using that data, who owns the data. There's just all sorts of ways you could go down, and you could teach an entire class just on ethics and technology.
Absolutely. I was almost hoping that you already are teaching that class. I'm sure it will come in the future.
Yeah.
It's gaining a lot of, at least in business schools, I think the whole impact and ethics and sustainability is gaining more and more impact because there are things that we're increasingly more worried about and more interested in. So I think that's going to be a pretty sweet place to spot to be at.
Right.
So Scott, we, as you know, you mentioned that you've heard a couple of episodes or a few episodes before. And as you know, we like to dive right into a very exciting question. And it's a question about failure. And what we would like to know is if you can tell us a story about your favorite, what you would call maybe your favorite fail or first attempt in learning in one of these experiences that you've had in creating, maybe it was creating your game, maybe it was doing something similar around game-based learning, teaching with games, creating games for the class, or something around those lines. Is there a story like that you can tell us? And again, it can be initial failure or final failure. There's such thing as a fatal failure,
a whole
at least.
Catalog of catastrophe here from which I could choose from. But I would say that one of the first things when I started out, I started to realize that the lecture is dead and we need to have some active learning exercises. And I think one of the first exercises I did was a kind of a classic game in supply chain called the beer game. And I had inherited the materials to do this from another professor that had been here. Yes. And I read through the directions and I thought, okay, I'm ready to go into class tomorrow. And not piloting it with some either volunteer students or some friends or something like that, you really just don't understand where people are going to go or how they might not understand your directions because they don't have the same experience you do. So I would say things that I thought were kind of common knowledge, and obviously with my undergraduate students, they didn't know what the heck I was talking about. So taking the time to pilot these exercises. So now if I am developing something like this blockchain game, one of the things I did was ask for student volunteers, got some of my friends to come in and help me walk through it a couple times, get some critical feedback. I had it actually much more complicated than it is now because I wanted to be more true to, exactly how a blockchain works. And I realized, well, I needed to kind of abstract a little bit more from that and try and get some of these fundamental concepts down. So I think not piloting things was one of my initial newbie mistakes in gamification.
Fantastic. And I see there's many things I'd like to comment on, but two of them is one of the learning that you mentioned that is about playtesting, which is a recurring topic, definitely. And the other one is, you mentioned the level of complexity. And this is, in my experience, especially in higher education, sometimes when we create these interactive experiences, these games, all these kinds of experiences, sometimes, and especially when you're a subject matter expert like yourself, you might tend to go towards something that is more of a simulation of reality than towards something, and this is a tendency, this is a natural thing, than going for the teaching objective you're actually trying to achieve. And I think you mentioned the beer game. The beer game is a fantastic example of how to do that possibly right. And of course, there's many things involved about the whole beer game. One of the things that I like about that simulation is that the beer game is geared towards something very specific. The amount of decisions you have to make is very, very limited, at least in the classic beer game and the one that we use at IE as well. The decisions are very straightforward, very simple. And many people argue like, but it's too simple. Reality is a lot more complex. And you say, yes, but when you're trying, and at least the way that we use it is to teach the bullwhip effect on the supply chain, you can absolutely do it, and it's super impactful because you see all the effects that happen throughout the beer game. And I don't want to say too much because if a future student listens to this, I don't want to spoil his or her experience.
Right.
But I think it does a fantastic job in narrowing it down to the simple instructions that you have to do, and the very few things that you have to decide in a simulation, so that you can learn exactly what the simulation is geared towards. And of course, it does require preparation. It does require play testing, understanding how is your jazz going to be in the class, how is it going to work for you in your classroom. But I think that is something great that I pull out both from your experience with your game and with the beer game in a sense of a contrast. Because I think that a lost opportunity sometimes is that we try to simulate reality as closely as possible, which in the end is going to be impossible. I mean, reality is too complex to simulate entirely, and that's why we simulate a part of it. But also, we lose track of what we want to achieve. And usually there is a learning objective or a series of learning objectives behind that, and you don't need to simulate 100% of reality for that. And that helps, narrow down complexity in development, narrow down the complexity of many things, and of course, reach your actual objective. So fantastic story. I loved it as well.
Well, I also like the physicality of the beer game and the fact that you didn't, like you said, you didn't have to make many decisions. You didn't have to be a technical expert in supply chain to understand what was going on at the end. And so that's when I decided to do some exercise to explain blockchain. I looked at different ways you could do that with computer simulation or with a spreadsheet. And I thought, no, I want something that people have in their hands. And because it's also less intimidating for somebody that's non-technical. And frankly, a lot of non-technical managers are going to have to make decisions about whether blockchain is an appropriate technology for their company to start investigating. And so it's not just going to be the tech folks or accounting folks that are good with numbers. It's going to have to be everybody that's going to have some knowledge about this technology and what its benefits might be. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I think another thing is I try to inject a lot of humor into the game. So in this game, they have to do some calculations. And so I always tell them, it's very difficult to do math in public. So what you do is if you think the answer is 2, you want to say 2-ish, because then it could be 1 or it could be 3, and I make jokes about math not being an exact science and things like that. And I think that takes a little pressure off of the students because in this game, they would actually announce, I think the answer is 2 or 3 for a variable that we're calculating.
Yeah, exactly.
And I give them little goofy gifts, like when I'm on the airlines or when I'm traveling or at a trade show or something, I'll get some goofy gifts and I hand those out as prizes. And they, kind of like that. And it gives them a little break to laugh about, somebody just got some socks or something like that. So
that's cool. Just one additional thing. I think it's great that you use the physical version of the beer game, and there's also digital versions as well, which work fantastically. But there's a lot to gain from, as you say, a physical game. But we want to take a small shift, actually a very, very wide shift, and go from this favorite fail where you learned a lot, and I'm sure you've incorporated many of these things to your regular practice, and now go actually for a big win. So what would you say is a big challenge that you faced and you actually solved using, game thinking, game-based solutions, gamification, however you want to call it, or whatever you want to use, or creating a game to solve that problem that you were seeing?
Well, I've been pretty happy with the blockchain game. That's kind of my first attempt at having something that was my own creation. I've also used a lot of Lego exercises. So I teach project management, and there's just a wide body of games and exercises out there to use Lego for teaching techniques such as Scrum. And so every year my project management class builds a city out of Legos using the Scrum framework. And so I think that's been kind of a big win is learning how to adopt that, but then also being able to see that other people are using my game. So being able to release it as Creative Commons. And so that's been exciting to me. Another professor in Germany has translated into German. So it's kind of neat to see something that you put out there and people have found useful. So that's been kind of a big win this past year.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Incorporating all of these things is always a big win. And do you have any reference? Like, where do you go to when you want to find? I mean, you're maybe teaching something new. You're trying to incorporate something that has been recently coming out. I don't know. When you try to look for something that was not already there, where are your references? Where do you go to?
Well, there's so much stuff that's being shared right now. And so, I frankly just start Googling around and finding places. A lot of these places like the Project Management Institute have directories for teachers. I'm finding more and more that authors of books will sometimes have a teaching guide. This is like not a textbook, but I know that I used a book called The All-In Startup, which is a really neat book about startups, but it's told in a fictional series. And this entrepreneur that has a startup that isn't doing well decides to go to the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, and he's going to make back money to make payroll. And so that's kind of the scenario for the book. And through that, Diana Kander is the author of that, and she talks about, how you test ideas, and it's all this lean approach to startups. And so then she has I had read the book, and then she has this like teacher guide where you can use experimentations. And so I'm finding that there's a lot of popular authors that are out there that are realizing that their book or their resource could be used in a classroom context, and providing some of those resources for professors. So it's not just going to the Journal of Management or the Journal of Teaching Management, which is fine. There's some great things there, but they are maybe a little more academic than some of our students can relate to. I just find that there's a lot more of that kind of thing coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's basically the everybody's resource, which is Google. Don't be afraid of looking for things out there. Chances are you'll find something good.
Picasso, I think, said, "The good artists borrow, great artists steal," right? So don't be afraid to steal somebody else's idea and adapt it to your own situation.
Absolutely. Always being respectful of, copyright laws and so on. But I absolutely agree.
Yes.
So when you create, maybe like when you created your blockchain game or the next things that you're developing now, or when you're thinking about implementing or using some playful activity or some game in your classroom, do you have some sort of process you go through? Like, what do you do? What's your thinking behind these things? Pick maybe one or all of them. Like, how do you approach it? Is there a process behind it?
For this, I had to really step back and try to boil down what are the things that I could get across in 40 minutes. So with blockchain, there's a whole lot of things that you could try to concentrate on, all sorts of rabbit holes you could go down. But I tried to think, what are the fundamental objectives that I want to have them walk away with? That this is a decentralized ledger, so forth and so on, different concepts. And then we actually tested that. So we tested that using a Qualtrics survey before and after with the students, and then other groups that I gave this game to, and then found that there were one or two objectives where it was not, the point wasn't really getting across. So I found that, for example, questions about fraud, people still thought, well, it was easy to commit fraud on a blockchain. Well, I think the problem was that I wasn't making the differentiation between Bitcoin, where there's been a lot of fraud, not necessarily hacking, but outright fraud, tricking people, and blockchain. And so what I did was I've adapted my game so that I actually run into the corner of the room whenever I'm talking about Bitcoin. And I say, okay, I'm going to be over here if I'm talking about Bitcoin. I do this like funny little run, and, students laugh at that. But I run over there whenever I'm talking about Bitcoin. And so we found that that helped a lot because it separated out these two related technologies, that something that applies to Bitcoin does not always apply to blockchain, and vice versa.
Nice. Very interesting. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. What would you say, Scott, when you're thinking about, using games in the classroom, or when you're thinking about using these playful attitudes and all these things, would you say there is a best practice or something that if people use, think about, strategize around, is there a best practice that you could transmit to the audience, to the engagers? If you had that, what would it be? And, give us a quick, a quick string of what that looks like.
Well, I guess for me, the where I look for a game or an activity like this is when I realize that students, especially my undergraduate students, don't have the real world experience to understand why this is important. So often going at this whole starting with why. And sometimes we're teaching academic, our academic curriculum, and we just assume that students are going to understand that's important to think about earned value metrics when we're dealing with a large project. So if you can actually have them, this semester I had them actually create some little skyscrapers out of paper, and we actually did earned value calculations on those as the skyscrapers were built. Well, now we can say, okay, well, think about this when, the One Trade Center is being built. How did they measure their progress? Trying to give them something hands-on that they can relate to, because I think that's just a big problem. And in some ways, I kind of wish that we had more of a gap year here in the United States where you might go out and work and then come back, and then you would understand relationship with customers. You'd understand why some of this is important. So I'm often looking for activities where we have something that is not going to be obvious to the students as to why this is important for a business, why this is important for an organization. So when we talk about culture, I have them go interview people about culture in their companies because they don't think about culture because they're in education culture in the United States, which is kind of homogenized in a lot of ways, right? I'm not sure there's a difference between being a high schooler or a college student here versus being a college student in Florida, right? So there's a lot of similarities. But when you get onto companies, there's a wide variety of culture, and it affects how well they can perform.
Absolutely. So thinking about different things there, absolutely. And going down a small rabbit hole here, you've heard a few of the interviews here. When you hear this, when you have experienced as well the interview yourself, is there somebody that comes to your mind that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game? Maybe that has been already, if you, of course, you haven't listened necessarily to all the interviews, maybe that you think should be, again, have been or not been before, a dream, person who would be super difficult. Idea here is to go for, Santa's list.
Well, that's an interesting, I would have to think about that a little bit, but there's certainly some authors that I think have done a very good job with their books. So there's one, I apologize, I'm forgetting the name.
If you remember the
now.
book, maybe I can help you.
I'm looking on my bookshelf right now for the book, but this idea of radical transparency. So I forget the author's name. It's a woman, and she talks about how you have radical transparency in an organization and what the power of that is. Ray Dalio,
yes.
I think would be a great, you might want to reach out to him for the Professor Game, because one of the things that they do is in meetings, at the end of the meeting, everybody kind of grades each other. They have their own specialized iPad app, and you would say, well, Ray did a very poor job of conducting the meeting because he didn't listen to what Sarah had to say or contribute, and they have this idea that providing radical feedback. I've always been fascinated with the idea that could you do that in a classroom? Could you kind of have that radical candor between students and a professor? One of my graduate classes, we tried that with, and I think it met with some success. I did not allow students to criticize each other because I was just worried that we would not have enough time to kind of create the culture around that transparency. But I did allow them to anonymously provide feedback about me. So I used an anonymous Qualtrics survey. And so after each lecture, they would grade me on my performance and also say, where I was lacking or what I did well. And so I would say something, how could we use, I don't know if we could use gamification, but how could we bring some of these ideas about radical transparency into the classroom? So I think that would be a fascinating one to explore.
Huh. Interesting. And the whole idea, I just wanted to jump in for a second here because, two things. One is there's no gamification or games without feedback. So I think that is a core thing for any of these worlds. So that I think that is very, very important and as immediate as possible. So right after the meeting, right after the class, it sounds like a very enticing idea. That's one. The other one is a question because I don't know about where you work at the University of Missouri or elsewhere as well. We have a very strong culture towards students also grading, and I'm air quoting here, the professors. So we are also evaluated with the basis of what students sort of think about us, how they perceive the class, and their sort of grade of satisfaction. So of course, it's not the only metric, it's not the main metric, but it is important, and it is something that we have to consider. So, I mean, do you have something like that? Did that impact your measures?
Yes,
How did that go?
Yeah, unfortunately we do, and unfortunately it's the main measure. And I say unfortunately because it happens at the end of the semester, and there's been several papers that have shown some pretty heavy bias, especially against younger female faculty members in these evaluations. There's also ways to kind of game the evaluations as well, so that you get higher marks. And so I really do not like the emphasis is placed on those. I think it should be student popularity survey, and that would probably be a more appropriate title for it. But there's other ways that we might be able to get meaningful feedback. So with all my classes, I do a start, stop, and continue exercise at the end of each semester. So I tell them, I'm going to be teaching this again next semester. I cannot make 30 improvements to this class, but I could probably do one or two. So I have them work in little groups and come up with one or two things that I should start doing that I haven't been doing, maybe something they've seen that worked really well in another professor's class, something that I should stop doing that just they felt was not worthwhile in the class, didn't add to the class, and things I should continue doing. And that's actually been very valuable, and I listened to that closely. And so the next semester I will, for example, I've added more quizzes into one of my classes because they felt like the tests were too high stakes and they needed more quizzes. And so we put that in. So I think that's meaningful feedback, whereas sometimes on the forums, you'll get the people that love you and they tell you about how great you are, and you'll get the people that hate you and they tell you about how they couldn't stand you, and you're just not getting, something that's usable. So I really hate those types of evaluations that we just hand out, give them 10 minutes to think about it and collect them all.
I understand, but they're kind of a reality of the business, so to speak, right now.
Right. But so I try to do other things to improve my classes. And, I'm hopeful that maybe we'll see that culture kind of change a little. And I wouldn't mind it if we had more time for thoughtful, feedback like that from the students. I do still provide for my classes an anonymous form where they can, in fact, provide feedback at any time during the semester. So it's just an open Qualtrics survey that then emails me once a week with any results.
Great. Sounds great. So getting immediate feedback and staying sort of in the same realm of recommendations. You just recommended Ray Dalio, that you would like to listen from Ray in Professor Game. Is there a book that you would recommend to the engagers, and why would you recommend that book?
Well, I think Ray Dalio's book is good, and I'm now blanking on the name of the book that he wrote. Once you become 50, these things have to buffer a little bit, so it'll be here in about 5 minutes. I think that's a good book. There's also one written by Scott Adams that I think is titled something like "How to Lose at Everything and Still Win Big," and he's the guy who wrote the Dilbert comic strip.
Yeah,
and it talks about
every day.
So he talks about how he thinks about probability, how he thinks about projects, so that one of the objectives of any project should not be the project itself, but also capability building. So I look at that when I'm looking at taking on new projects. Will I learn something from this that I can take away and build on for future success, independent of whether this particular project does well or not? So he has a lot of good advice, and that's probably I've probably given away 20 copies of that to students, especially students that have kind of been struggling in academia, so I keep several copies here on my in my office to give away.
Interesting. I just Amazoned instead of Googled Ray Dalio, and I found Principles, Big Debt Crisis, and Principles for Success.
great.
So one of those is probably the book about radical transformation. Radical feedback?
Radical Candors. There's another book called Radical Candor, and it's not written by Ray Dalio, but it's along those same themes.
So there you go. We have quite a few recommendations going around for the engagers. And when creating these games, when using these games in class, what would you say is your superpower?
Well, I think my superpowers, I'm willing to, I don't know if I'd say act the fool, but I'm willing to make fun of myself. So I think that is one thing that not all teachers in higher education are willing to do, but I'm certainly don't mind making fun of myself, and I don't mind having something that doesn't work perfectly. And so if I'm doing something with technology or something like that, and it doesn't work perfectly, I don't get upset about it. I think other folks think they're more on a performance, right? They're more on a stage, and they have to make sure all their technology works perfectly. And you have to just be willing to adapt and say, oh, well, that didn't work today. Well, we'll try it again sometime later. Let's move on to this other thing that we can do now. So I think that's part of it, just being willing to be a little informal about how you conduct some of these classes. And every course I teach, I try to do something different, at least with one of the subjects that I think could be improved every year. So I tell my students, hey, this is an experiment. We're going to try something new. And we'll spend the next 20 minutes just trying this new activity, and we'll see how it works. And so I think being honest with your students that you are trying something new really helps a lot, because they will be a lot more forgiving when something doesn't work perfectly.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely something to strive for. I think we're coming back again to a bit of the transparency side. But Scott, there's probably the most difficult question in the podcast, and is the one that I'm going to go for now, at least from the feedback of past guests. What would you say is your favorite game?
Well, I'm kind of old school. I play backgammon, so that's my favorite game to play. But my students keep on referencing their Switches, so I did buy a Switch recently, and I now play Zelda, something called The Wild.
Breath of the Wild or something like that, yeah.
And it's my TA has brought in her Switch, and she's got this giant shield and, battle armor, and I'm still running around in raggedy pants. So, I'm not sure I'm completely understanding what I should be doing in that game, but it's just been amazing to see, 30 years ago when I was playing games on an Apple IIe, and we actually had to type in our games. You'd get a magazine, and you'd actually have to type in those games in there. And I think about just how far that's come to something like that. It's just amazing. And I think that's one of the reasons I get distracted from the main quest, is I'm off, screwing around with some lake or something, and when I should be moving on and killing things or something.
That sounds great, Scott. And before we take off, because I've had a lot of fun. I hope you've had to, and the engagers have been taking a lot of value, which I think has been dropped in this episode, definitely. I would like to know if you have any quick final advice you want to leave us with. Tell us, of course, where we can find you, any plug you want to make. This is the plug zone as well, for your game or whatever. And then, of course, we'll say it's game over.
All right. Well, I would just say, don't be afraid to try something. Don't be afraid to experiment in your classes, and that students will be much more forgiving if they see that you're trying something new. So I would say get out there and see what you're doing where you're having a difficulty getting a particular point across, and see if you can modify that or create some sort of game or even just short activity around it. As far as how you can reach me, I'm on Twitter's the only social network I'm really on much, and it's jscottmo on Twitter, or you can find me at my website, which is christiansonjs.com, and that's where I post a lot of these things. So I have a resources page, so you'll find the blockchain game, you'll find a Creative Commons version of a project management textbook I wrote, And I'm also working on some other exercises that I've used in my classes that were Creative Commons but share alike. And so now I'm getting to where I'm going to share alike the modifications I've made to some of these games that thankfully some other professor invented.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Scott. This has been a pleasure to have this chat with you today. However, for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
All right. Excellent.
Engagers, it is fantastic to have you around. And this podcast only makes sense if we have you around. So let's connect on Twitter. That way you can let me know about, what's in your mind, if there's anybody you would like to have to listen to as a guest. Again, as usual, any questions that you might have for the podcast, anything you think we might be able to help you with. So you can find my Twitter account very easily at professorgame.com/Twitter. I'm always sharing content on gamification, on education, and, every now and then there is a rant here and there. But hey, don't click continue yet. Do you want to know what is some of the relation between UX or user experience and gamification? Then all you have to do is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.